Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here. I know some of you traveled a great distance to attend this very special occasion. It is such an honor to be here tonight with all of you who share with the University of Nevada and the Autism Coalition of Nevada our mutual passion, which is autism. I want to thank UNR and ACON for all of the support and effort involved in putting this together. It means so much. Autism is no longer about the occasional child you hear about at a school or in your neighborhood who has some sort of disability. Rather, it has surged to the national forefront as a topic of supreme importance, catching parents, physicians, scientists, educators off guard with staggering statistics. The University of Nevada and the Autism Coalition of Nevada both seek to raise awareness and to make a difference in the lives of the families in this state. UNR is keenly aware of the impact that autism is having on children developmentally and academically. ACON is continuously advocating, researching, and impacting legislation to make certain that the needs of the people of Nevada are being recognized and addressed. Tonight, we have a very special guest who reflects the amazing aspects of a life impacted by autism. At 3 years old, she was speech delayed and socially challenged. She was diagnosed with autism, and her mother was told she should be institutionalized. Instead, she went on to achieve a doctorate degree and has become a famous inventor, author, and worldwide autism advocate. In 2010, she was named one of Time magazine's top 100 most influential people in the Heroes category. Her achievements have not been in spite of her autism, they have been because of it. People in her world wanted to change her. Instead, she has helped to change the world. This incredible woman inspires us and gives hope to everyone who is touched by autism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Temple Grandin.
Well, it's really great to be here today, and got quite a few different things to talk about. I'm going to talk some about autism, some about livestock. I think, first of all, I'll just talk a little bit about the autism spectrum. It's a very big spectrum, and it's a continuous trait. You know, you disconnect some social circuits, and then you get Silicon Valley circuits. Because Steve Jobs, I'm almost sure, was on the spectrum. I've read everything about him, and when he gave his very first interview on TV, he was so nervous he almost vomited. And when I gave my first graduate school talk, I panicked and walked out, so gradually get better. Einstein had no language till age 3. A lot of school systems would have diagnosed him as autism. Then you get down on the other end of the spectrum, where you've got very severe autism, where they are nonverbal, they have many, many problems, maybe epilepsy and other medical problems on top of autism. So it's a huge spectrum, and where a little bit of it brings you computers. Because who do you think made the first stone spear? It certainly wasn't the social yakety-yaks around the campfire, that's for sure. Now, one thing I can't emphasize enough in autism is the importance of early intervention. If you have a young kid, I don't care what label he's got, but if he doesn't talk and he's doing a lot of weird behavior and not interacting, the worst thing you can do is nothing. These little kids need at least 20 hours a week, one-to-one teaching. And you got to teach them words. Teach them things like turn-taking. I was really bad about turn-taking. I was taught turn-taking with the Parcheesi board. And, I'd go to take a turn, and, Mother would say, well, you got to wait for your sister to take her turn. So early intervention's really, really important. So I think I'll get into my slides now. And if you want to understand animal behavior, you've got to get away from verbal language. The animals' world is a sensory-based world, a world of thinking and pictures, a world of hearing, sounds, smell. Think about all the information that the dog gets off a local fire hydrant. He's going to know who was there, how long ago they were there, It is just the coffee shop full of information. But the thing about sensory-based information is it's very detailed, extremely detailed. So try to just imagine what it's like to not have words. And there's a very rich emotional world and cognitive world when there is no language. But it's all sensory. Just try to imagine not having any words. Now there's evidence in normal human beings that language covers up things like mathematics and visual thinking. Because if you look at this Van Gogh painting, Starry Night, and you got those twirls up there, some mathematicians got a hold of that, and they said it followed a statistical pattern of water turbulence. Now, I don't think Van Gogh knew anything about mathematics, but he was painting it into his paintings. There's also a type of Alzheimer's disease that as it wrecks the frontal cortex and it wrecks the language parts of the brain, art talent comes out. So the visual thinking, the mathematical thinking, it's sort of hidden underneath language in most people. The autistic world is a world of detail. Animal world is a world of detail. This is kind of a classic test of detail versus the whole gestalt thinking. And you got some big letters there made out of little letters. And the autistic person's going to pick out the little letters much, much faster than he picks out the big letters. That's detail thinking. Now, some research that was done at the University of Pittsburgh shows that the normal mind drops out the details. Well, there's a bad detail on that slide up there. The guy's got a brain tumor. Maybe I need to get rid of that slide. That slide is kind of a mistake, but then I got so many people thought it was funny, so I left it in there. Well, what the researchers did at the University of Pittsburgh is they put people in the brain scanner. They start out with someone with autism, and they'd have a readout of a book, and the functional MRI lights up just to the detail of the words. Then they put the Asperger, that's like a milder form of autism, and he reads out of the book, and both the detail part and the syntax over a whole part lights up. Now, guess what happens when you put the normal person in there? All the detail drops out. Well, I think this is one of the problems. They have a lot of policy stuff today, is it's all gotten too abstract, because there's a lot of important details. And if you overlook some of these important details, you're really going to be in a whole lot of trouble. Bridge is going to fall down if you don't pay attention to certain things. Now, the very first work that I did with livestock was to see why they didn't want to go through the chutes. In this particular place, it's too dark in the chute. They've got these like super environmentally correct water bottles, and I just pick it up and the water comes out. They're really, I know they're environmentally correct, but they're really terrible, and the whole floor is covered with water now, because I can't even lift the water bottle without it spilling. So the first work that I did was to see why in some places the cattle would go through the chutes and other places they wouldn't. Well, it'd be things like the flag as they're waving. You got rapid movement, high contrast of light and dark. And too often, they want to tear down the whole facility when all they needed to do was simply move the flag. Now look at how that animal is looking right at that streak of sunlight. They notice details. If you're trying to drive the cattle down the alley, you may just stop at that streak of sunlight. Most people don't see these things. I give people verbal checklists on how to find these things, but they still don't see them. So I would get down in the chutes to see what the cattle were seeing and look at the things that will make them balk there. You got shadows, you got people there, you got to look for the details. And sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. Now, when I first started working with cattle, I thought everybody thought in pictures. I didn't know that my thinking was different. I thought everybody thought the same way that I think. And later on, in the mid-'90s, when I started working on my book, Thinking in Pictures, I realized that there are other ways of thinking. Now, one question I get asked over and over and over again is, do the cows know they're going to get slaughtered? Well, so I went to the Swift plant, and I watched the cattle going up the chute, and in the movie they turned it into Abbott, because they couldn't use the Swift names that still exists. But bad old Scottsdale Feed Yard, where I got kicked out for being a girl, we could use their name because they were bulldozed 25 years ago. So their name got used. So I'd watch the cattle going up the Swift plant, and then I'd go out to a feed yard and I'd watch the cattle going up the chute. They behaved the same way in both places. They knew they were going to get slaughtered. They ought to be a lot wilder at the Swift plant. And I found they were afraid of things like it's too dark. There's a reflection. There's a chain hanging down. I've gone into a lot of meat plants now, and I'm amazed how I can fix them with a portable light, duct tape, and cardboard. Boy, you just cover up the right things that cattle are afraid of, and then they walk up the chute. Tape a light on the entrance of a chute, and they'll go right in. You know, sometimes I almost can't believe that it works as well as it does. Now, look at things like for detail in the animal's posture. Like, look how the horse and the zebra have an ear on each other. What are the ears doing? What are the eyes doing? You know, well, next time you look at your dog, what's he looking at? What's he paying attention to? I want you to just look at it. Try to think about how the animal is experiencing something. Now, I'm a total visual thinker. And this is a picture a young man sent to me to show how he had movies in his head. Well, I thought everybody had movies in his head. You know, sometimes the most obvious is the least obvious. And I've been reading all the stuff about the Japanese nuclear power plant. And I'm going, how could they have made the mistake that they made? And I'm finally beginning to realize that they didn't see it. Doesn't make too much sense to me when you live next to the sea to put the power generators, the emergency generators that run the emergency cooling pumps when everything breaks in the basement when you're by the sea. Because what do you think happens to those diesels when they get underwater? Well, they don't work. And that's why 4 nuclear power plants blew up. Now, it's like so obvious. I'm like going, bah. Well, I'm now realizing that the visual thinker sees that. Where the mathematician, I don't know how to design a nuclear reactor, but I do know that diesels don't work underwater very well. And that I wouldn't put them where they could get underwater. You know, well, this is where I'm going to be talking a little later on about the importance of different kinds of minds. But everything is like a movie in my head. And the HBO movie did a really great job of showing how I think in pictures. And by the way, it's available on Amazon. Now, I realized my thinking was different when I asked people about church steeples. And I was really shocked at what I learned. I said, think about a church steeple. How does it come into your mind? And I was shocked to learn that most people get this vague, generalized image. I don't get a generalized image. I only get specific ones. I'm going, wow, you mean you get a generalized, vague, generic steeple? Now, if I ask you house or car, most people will see their own house or car. But I ask you something you don't own, like a factory or something like that, maybe the post office. A lot of people tend to get a much more generalized image. Well, I just get specific ones. And they kind of just flash up into my mind like a series of slides. And I can just put them up there like that. And if I hold it there and go, oh, you want a snowstorm there? You want a thunderstorm there? What do you want? See if I can drink out of these water bottles. You can't even pick them up without them squirting all over the place. It starts out as still pictures. They come up as a series of still pictures. And then if I hold one of them, I can turn it into a video. Now, being a visual thinker really helped me in my work with livestock because I could test run things in my head. I didn't know that other people couldn't do that. Well, it didn't get me very many friends when I told other people they were stupid. Well, now I realize it's not stupidity. It's different ways of thinking. And there's a scene in the movie where they ruin my dip fat design, my nice non-slip ramp, put metal on it, drown the cattle in there, because they just didn't understand how the cattle could just walk down the ramp. That actually happened, just like the movie showed it. Now, my center track restrainer for meat plants, I got the same exact kind of ramp, and it's non-slip, and guess what happens? One plant cut it off, and another plant took all the cleats off and made it slippery. It says, well, you just jam the cattle together. Well, you don't have to do that. I think they just can't see how the animals could just walk in there if you just have it right from a behavior standpoint. They don't see it because they weren't maliciously trying to mess it up. They thought they were fixing it. And there's an aerial view of the dip vat they built for the movie. And the geek side of me really likes the fact they duplicated all my projects exactly right. And there's one of my drawings. When you're really weird, and people think you're really super weird, no, super weird in the movie, but when I whipped out one of my drawings, people went, ooh, you did that. So one of the things I learned is I learned to sell my work. I've got a really nice portfolio of drawings and photos of jobs, and I'd show those things to clients, and that's how I sold projects. One thing I did find, it was a lot easier to sell them the thing than it was to get them to operate it correctly. In the last 10 years, I've been working on getting it to operate correctly. After I started working on the McDonald's animal welfare program. I was not so involved with the chicken thing. Some may have heard about that. Okay, and there's another drawing of the dip vat system I did at the Red River Feed Yard. And I teach a class where I have students draw livestock handling facilities. And you might wonder why the curves. Cattle have a natural tendency to go back to where they come from. You see, you want to use that natural behavior. And I have to teach my students how to look at the lines on the drawing and relate that to the actual thing. So I'd switch them back and forth like this. And that's something I had to teach myself. And I was lucky enough to get the whole great big blueprint for the whole entire SWIFT plant. Everything, the parking lots, the water tower, everything. And I walked around that plant in about 3 days of that drawing until I could relate every line on that drawing to a real structure, like a big circle is a water tower. A little square is a concrete column that holds up the roof. And then I could then look at the drawing and start seeing the picture. And there's the actual thing. Now, I noticed a weird and rather disturbing thing as the industry switched in the early 90s from hand drafting to computers. And when the old people switched over, their drawings were really good. But we had some young people came in that had never drawn by hand and they'd never built anything. And they started making strange mistakes on drawings. They weren't seeing their drawings. Like they didn't put the center of a circle in the center of the circle because they'd never drawn a circle with a compass. You got to touch stuff. And I had a chance to go out and visit Pixar and some of the other creative companies. It's really, really interesting. And I talked to them about this problem. And they said that sometimes they got to get them off the computers and just get them drawing. And now they have a thing called a 3D printer, so they can like make the little Buzz Lightyear or whatever figure in the computer. And then there's this machine that can print them, and you come out with a little sculpture about this high that's a little statue of the thing you drew. And I noticed that they had these little statues all around their cubicle next to the computer. Why? So they could hold them. You see, that's to get that touch feedback. If you don't get that touch feedback, you don't see things right. And I found this happened with every single major meat company. Every time I investigated where the drawing came from, it was some guy in his 20s, never drawn by hand, never built anything. You know, this is why you need to do stuff with your hands that teach the eye to see correctly. And today in the New York Times, I read an article about, fancy sets of blocks to, you could get kindergarten kids to play with. So they'll learn how to put things together mechanically. Now, some little kids, autism and some other labels, sometimes show up with drawing skills young. I'm a big proponent of building up the talent areas. The skills tend to be uneven. This happens with other labels too, like dyslexia and ADHD. Don't get hung up on these stupid labels. They are just behavioral profiles. And they are getting ready to change the labels. These diagnoses are not precise. You've got doctors sitting in conference rooms having giant fights, deciding on how to change the labels. Like in the DMS-5, they're going to have social communication disorder. I call that a good way to get out of having to pay for services. And nobody sits around a conference room and argues over the diagnosis for tuberculosis. I mean, tuberculosis is tuberculosis. You do a lab test, they can tell you exactly what kind of tuberculosis you have. So you want to, whatever the kid's good at, build it up. And my ability in art was really encouraged. You know, I had a tendency to just want to paint horse heads and draw horse heads all the time. My mother said, well, let's maybe do a beach. Take that ability and broaden it out. Let's say if the child wants to do airplanes all the time. Let's do the airport. Let's draw where an airplane goes. In other words, take that thing that he's fixated on and broaden it out. We've got to start thinking more about what are they going to do when they grow up. Also, kids need to be taught work skills. They need to be taught things like how to be on time. I think it's bad. Kids don't play in like 3 kids getting together and just making up their own games. Because that's a skill you're going to have when you grow up. There are these things called work groups at work. You're going to have to get along. You'll learn that when you're very young. Now, I used to joke around that I had a huge internet connection in my brain that went deep into the primary visual cortex. And yep, I do. Big, huge trunk line. When I got these scans back, I was like, oh, wow. That explains my visual thinking. Now, there's another kind of thinking. It's not my thinking. It's more of the classical visual spatial thinking. Think origami, think organic chemistry molecules and geometry and things like that. And that praying mantis is made out of a single sheet of folded paper. No taping, no cutting. And what you see in the background is the pattern for folding that. See, that's the pattern thinker. That's the mathematics mind. That's the guy who's going to design the reactor, but I think I better design the safety systems. As I can imagine everything stupid people can do with equipment. I used to have a saying when I was working out in construction all the time and working on supervising installation of some of my facilities was never underestimate the laziness and the stupidity of people operating equipment. And that certainly was what happened at Chernobyl. They turned off the safety systems to test them. That's what they did. I'm not kidding. That's what they did. Now, if that isn't super stupid, I don't know what is. It's not something I would do. Now, this is a really important slide. This is my slide on the different kinds of thinking. And when you get into autism, these tend to get very extreme. In so-called normal people, this gets less extreme. I'm a photorealistic visual thinker, what's called an object visual thinker. And couldn't do algebra. You see, there's nothing there to visualize. It just didn't make any sense. There's a number of kids that can't do algebra, but they can do geometry or trig, and they need to be jumped to geometry and trig. The other kind of mind is a pattern thinker. This is your little mathematicians. They often have trouble with English. You get into the normal people, you can get more mixtures of these things. Then you have the word thinker. This is the kid that likes all the weather reports, and he knows all the facts about his favorite things, and he likes history. And some people are auditory thinkers, especially if they've got problems with the visual system. They'll be an auditory thinker. I had a dyslexic student. She was a total auditory thinker. So, you get into all the arguments about different kinds of educational methods. Well, some things work for some kids and some things don't work for others. And we need to be thinking about how the different kinds of minds can work together. All right, let's go back to Steve Jobs. He did the art. He did the user experience. The engineers have to make the insides work. And on the iPhone 4, there was a little problem with antenna design, where if you hold it, because your hand went against the antenna and it messed up the reception. I mean, this is where there wasn't quite a good enough coordination between the art and the engineering, because you need to have both, to have really good things. Now, how do you form a concept when you just have all this specific information floating around in your head? It's by specific example. That's what's called bottom-up thinking. Most people it's top-down. You get some highfalutin theory that's so far away from reality that, it doesn't translate right to the ground. Somebody said to me, how would you improve the schools? Well, let's go look at specific schools that are really good. We'll put them over in this category, and we'll go look at some that are really horrible and put them in this category. And then what are some of the common denominators of good schools and bad schools? It would be done by specific example, rather than trying to take a theory and cram everything into it. Like reading this article today in the New York Times about the blocks. Yeah, that's great, but I don't think we're going to have a whole block way of doing education. I think that's just absolutely absurd, using blocks for teaching foreign language. I don't think so. That's just making a theory that's going too far. That's just ridiculous. But everything I learn specific example. If you're working with training your dog, if you just teach your dog to sit in the kitchen, he might think it only applies in the kitchen. You got to teach him in many different places. You want to teach this kid not to run across the street? You got to teach him in many different places. It's bottom-up thinking. It's one of the most important things, working with animals and working with some individuals on the autism spectrum. A dog has categories. When I'm on the leash, I protect my owner, and when I'm off the leash, I can play. There was this other dog that I belonged to a truck driver that was a husband of a really good friend of mine. And if that dog was in the cab, boy, he'd rip your hand off if you tried to go in that cab. But if you called the dog out of the cab, then he was friendly. So when the truck went to the mechanic shop, they would just call him out of the cab. Otherwise, he would have ripped the mechanics all up. But it's specific to general rather than the other way around. Another common problem you can get with animals is fear memories that are associated with things they were looking at or things they were hearing right when something bad happened. Like there was an elephant that was terrified of diesel-powered equipment. Boy, if it had a diesel engine, that was bad. If it had a gas engine, that was good, because the sound of that diesel was associated with something bad. There was a horse that was deathly afraid of black cowboy hats, because when he was looking at a black cowboy hat, that's right when something really bad happened. They'll tend to get these memories sometimes that don't make much sense. Like a dog might get afraid of where he was hit by a car, because that's what he was looking at right the moment that he got hit. Now, horses and cattle both differentiate between a man on the back and a man on the ground. And you might have cattle that are very, very tame and easy to handle when worked by a person on a horse, but if you walk out amongst them on foot, they just scatter. You see, it's a different picture. So the people walking out amongst them, that's something new and novel, where the horse going out there was something familiar. You see, the thing about a new experience with animals, if you just shove it in their face in a confined area, it's scary. But let's say you put something novel out in the middle of the pasture, when they can voluntarily approach, they'll all come up to it. Oh man, Holstein heifers, they'll just eat all the hydraulic hoses off a tractor. You know, that's the kind of things they'll do. Novelty is both scary and attractive. It's attractive when they can voluntarily approach, and it's scary if you suddenly just frighten them with it. Horses can get a situation where if they've had a bad experience with a horseshoer, they might be really bad about veterinary and any kind of work you do on the ground, and then be good for riding. If they've had a really bad experience with a rider, they'll not be just fine for veterinary work on the ground. You see, it's specific. See, word thinking's a lot less specific. Animals are into very specific. And the thing is, it's bottom up rather than top down. So how do you form a concept? Well, you've got to put a lot of specific information into file folders. Okay, here's just some examples here. You can have a kite that's up in the air. You can walk up the stairs. A plane flies up in the air. You've got to give different examples of up. Because if I just use the word up for going up the stairs, well, then I wouldn't understand it for some other uses like picking up a cup, maybe even picking up your room. You know, you've got to pick the junk up off the floor. That's picking it up. You know, teach number concepts with real things. You can have 3 notebooks, 3 pennies, 3 cars, 3 people, 3 bottles. You know, numbers apply to many different things. Teach fractions by, cutting up an apple. Do proportions. With cooking is a really good way to teach numbers. So how do you understand really big numbers, like all the money that was in the original bailout? How do you understand these amounts of money, like $1 billion, $100 billion? Well, our airport in Denver costs $5 billion. That'll give you everything except the airplanes and all the little vehicles they drive around underneath the airplanes and the rental cars. It gives you everything else, rental car offices and everything, cargo buildings. And our airport's worth $5 billion. So $100 billion is 20 Denver airports, and maybe a few more Reno airports. And that bailout money was equal to 2 big airports for every state. Now, if we started taking these things and converting it to my new unit, DIAs, Denver International Airport Units, that puts it into something where normal people can actually put their head around it, to get some idea of what this is worth. And it all went into a black hole to keep the banks from, going into a black hole. Just think of all the infrastructure and jobs they could have done with 2 airports worth of money in every state. It just makes me absolutely sick. But I'm somebody who's into actual real things. I'm not into the abstract. I'm into real stuff. Now, there's the horse that was terrified of black hats. Now, the thing is, if I put the hat down on the ground, it was less scary. And then as the hat got closer and closer and closer to my head, it got scarier and scarier. You see, it was getting to be a closer match to the picture. So when the black hat was up here, it was bad. White hats, no problem at all. Now I'm kicking myself that I didn't get this big black purse I had out of my car and put it on my head. Because I think that would have had the same effect. That would have been enough, looked like that probably would have scared him too. Now we need to think about different kinds of minds and think about how they can work together. Another thing we need to be doing with some of these kids on the spectrum is, they're 13 years old, some of these Asperger kids, they need to start learning some job skills. When I was 15, I cleaned out 9 horse stalls every day. And when I was 13, I did a sewing job. I was 15, 16 years old when I built that gate you could open up in the car. You got to learn how to use your skills to do stuff that other people want. And you might wonder, autism is so much autism today. Some of it with the Asperger's is increased diagnosis, because all the old Aspies now are coming out of the woodwork when their grandkids end up having autism diagnosis, and they go, well, I think I might have that too. And this is where a 50s upbringing helped, because they pounded in the social rules. You were taught how to shake hands. You were taught how to say please and thank you. You were taught how to take turns. The normal kids, they muddle through it. The Asperger's have a lot more problems. We've got to figure out how to work with different kinds of minds, because some of the best projects I've ever worked on, you had the different kinds of minds working together. I've used co-authors on a number of my books, because one of the problems with the visual thinking is I don't organize well. So I've got to have the co-author for the structure. And I'm working on another book right now on cognition, and I was talking with Richard Panik, who's going to be the co-author, and we were trying to figure out how to integrate some other stuff, and he says, well, you got to make sure we don't wreck the flow. I've kind of learned how to, I call it putting the ornaments on the Christmas tree without wrecking the flow now. Well, and we want to help students to be successful. It makes me really happy when I have kids write to me and say, well, your books motivated me to go out and do things. Because it's the people that kind of different that are going to figure out how to solve the energy crisis. We're short on engineers in this country. We're short on machinists. We're short on electricians, on a lot of the hands-on jobs. That's where we need to be, getting kids interested in things that can solve problems in the future. This is really bad. I can't see my slides. I can't emphasize enough the importance of mentor teachers. Science teacher was shown very, very nicely in the movie, and he got me motivated to study, because now I had a goal. I wanted to become a scientist, and good teachers can make such a difference. And the only places where I wasn't teased to death was in the science lab and while I was riding horses, because the kids who were interested in these specialized things weren't the kids that did the teasing. I could get away from that stuff and be in with people that were interested in the same things that I was interested in. I think it's a shame that so many schools have taken out the hands-on classes. I think it's terrible. These classes teach practical problem-solving skills. Art, music, wood shop, sewing, cooking, welding, auto shop. We have a shortage in this country right now of auto mechanics, diesel mechanics. There's a shortage. They're not going to fix cars from China. If I hadn't had those kind of classes, I would have just gone absolutely nowhere. Those were the things that saved me. Those were the things I was good at. Art was my favorite class when I was in elementary school. We need to be working with different kinds of people, figuring out how we can hire them. I want to talk a little bit about some other work that I've done on improving slaughter plants. There's been some bad stuff in the news lately. Well, that was chickens. And that particular chicken place had a reputation of being the worst chicken supplier in the industry. And those worst suppliers tend to get on the committees and water down the standards. But I developed a thing called the American Meat Institute Guideline in 1997, where I used really simple outcome measures to evaluate slaughter plants. It was like traffic rules for slaughter plant behavior. Because if you don't make something very, very simple, they're not going to understand it. And they didn't revolt because it was simple. Let me tell you what they had to do. If more than 3 cattle out of 100 bellow and moo when they're being handled, they fail the McDonald's audit. It's that simple. And when we first started out, you'd have 35% of the cattle bellowing because they were putting electric prods all over them. If you have more than 1 out of 100 fall down, you fail the audit. When we first started out, only 30% of the plants could shoot 95% of the cattle on the first shot because their equipment was broken. They simply didn't fix equipment. Now that's gotten way up around 97, 98%, and the USDA has gotten a lot stricter. But one of the problems is the USDA is stuck with some regulations that are very vaguely written with things like agitation and excitement. I don't know what agitation and excitement cattle is. I don't have trained inspectors on that. I've trained tons of auditors. What is minimize electric prod use? Let me put numbers on it. You better get 75% of those cattle into the plant with no electric prods. They're going to fail audit. It's just that simple. It's numbers, just like traffic rules. It's really worked. Now, the thing is, you're picking out just a few critical control points that measure a multitude of sins. There's all kinds of things that can make them move. Poke them with prods, slam doors on them, run other cattle on top of them, do all kinds of bad things. You see, the vocalization is an outcome measure of bad things. So what would I use for an outcome measure for schools? Well, first of all, get some internationally recognized tests. The other thing is, when they graduate, do they stay out of trouble with the law, get and keep decent jobs? You know, really, when you get right down to it, and if they, and you know, and some people might go into technical fields, others might go on to college and do things, but get and keep employment, decent employment where they advance some. That's the ultimate outcome measure. You know, that's the way I look at things, because I put the emphasis on what I can directly observe. Most people want to turn this all into a paperwork audit. Man, at some of the committees now, they got all this paperwork. No, there's certain things I want to directly observe, but you've got to figure out what's the important thing to directly observe. Well, nuclear power plants, you better fix the safety system so they can't turn them off. I'm going to make it impossible to turn them off. It's one thing. But the generators where they aren't going to get drowned. You know, some very, very important things like that. Airplanes. Again, when you do bottom-up thinking, airplane accidents. There's three things that can cause airplane accidents, really bad ones. The pilot messes up, weather, or something went wrong with the aircraft. And in the last 20 years, when it's been something wrong with the aircraft, there's been 5 or 6 accidents where the tail either fell off or really important steering stuff inside the tail broke, so the pilot couldn't steer the plane. So there's a lot of important tail stuff. So now, being a visual thinker, I'm now looking out the airport window, I'm seeing the pilot walking around the plane, I'm going, oh, well, he can see all the broken stuff that might be in the landing gear. So I'm not going to bother with inspecting that. I've got 10,000 zillion pilots doing that. But the tail stuff is all inside the tail. You can't see it. So if there's something you want to do random inspections on, it's going to be looking inside tail stuff. Because when the Alaska Airlines plane lost its tail, they pulled this jack screw thing out of the water, and it had metal shreds on it. It hadn't been lubricated since the plane was built. Maybe that's something that you need to be looking at. That's a critical control point. You see, when you use bottom-up thinking, I'm going, okay, what are the things that are really important? I was only going to look at 3 or 4 things on an airplane. I can tell you right now, it's going to be tail stuff. Or I could just summarize it with a single word, tail. It better not fall off. Bits and pieces of it better not come off. And the things that steer the airplane that are inside the tail better work, or you're in tons of trouble. And it's going to have to be inspected in the hangar. There's no way the pilot can see it. You see, now when I talk about this, I'm seeing it. Well, they don't let me do the pilot walk around, so I'm at the window of the airport, watching the pilot walk around the plane. And I can see the tail of the plane. Obviously can't see the things inside there that can break. You know, we need to be getting back to getting in touch with the ground. What's actually happening with stuff out there in the real world? Now, there's me as a high school doing the kind of things I really liked doing. That was the kind of stuff that I really thought was fun, of cutting up a board there to make the gate. Now, I want to end up and just talk about a few sensory problems you can get with autism, dyslexia, ADHD, head injuries also get this. Problems like sound sensitivity. Loud sounds hurt the ears. You can also get problems with visual sensitivity, where fluorescent lights flicker. These sensory issues are very variable, and they can be really debilitating. Like here's a little kid putting his hands over his ears. Loud sounds hurt. If there's one place where there needs to be doing research, it's on how to treat some of these sensory problems, because they vary from being a mild nuisance to being absolutely, totally debilitating. And another problem you get whenever there's a difficulty with the brain is attention-shifting slowness. Like I still have problems with rapid movement stuff in front of me. I have a hard time screening that out. And there's something wrong with the brain, slows down the processing speed. And some people, when they go to read, the print will jiggle on the page. I'm finding in a class of 50 students, I find one of these every single semester. They absolutely cannot draw. Like if I ask them to just draw this, like this, no, this is what they draw. And they have problems with driving at night. They don't like escalators. This problem's real common. I'll tell you some simple fixes for this. Try printing your homework on different pastel paper, gray, tan, light blue. Try playing around with the background on the computer colors. Maybe use a Kindle, because that reduces contrast. Some people are helped with pale colored glasses, like pale pinks, pale lavender glasses. I've had students go out sunglass shopping, and I had one lady, she came back and she said, well, I got an A on my economics quiz because the print's not jiggling anymore, and I can actually read the professor's PowerPoint slides. Well, I want to leave plenty of time to do questions. I'm supposed to be having some microphones roving around. And I want to do, if nobody has a question, I'm going to pick somebody. So somebody better get their hand up right now. Okay, I'm going to pick, right there. Okay, I'll answer that. Okay, the question was, do I remember the transition from being verbal to nonverbal? I can remember the absolute frustration of not being able to talk. I had problems with speech output. There's different kinds of speech problems you can have. And my problem is in speech output. In fact, my brain scan was shown on 60 Minutes. And don't even think about doing that kind of scanning at the hospital. That was scanning paid for by the Department of Defense for veterans. And it's a very special kind of scanning that sees sort of big interstate highways of neurons in the brain. And you're supposed to have a 4-lane highway for speech output. I'm down to a 1-lane highway. Other kids are like a lay-like, where they can yak out all the words, but they don't know what they mean. So speech output's working fine, but they don't understand it. I had some receptive language problems. When people talked really fast, I could not hear hard consonant sounds. The hard consonants would just drop out. So my speech teacher would do is she'd slow down. Like she'd hold up a cup and she'd say, "Cup, slow down and enunciate." Okay, right here. I guess they don't have a mic here. Oh, right, good, you got it, okay.
When you imagine things, it's obviously instantaneously. Do you have a problem with the patience and actually seeing it built in the real world?
Seeing what built in the real world?
When you imagine, like, your drawings.
Oh, no, when I draw a drawing, I can actually see it built in the real world.
Right, but
Yeah.
then to actually wait for it to be built, is that frustrating to you?
No, it's just kind of fun to watch it be
Okay.
built. You know, I'd
Okay.
go down and you know, make sure they were building it right. No, it's really kind of fun to watch them make it.
What do you think about a child that is always holding his ears?
Well, he's holding his ears because sound hurts his ears.
So
That's why he's holding his ears.
Do you have any recommendations of things that might help that?
Sometimes that can be helped if the child has control of the sound. Okay, let's say a real common one is they can't stand going in the supermarket, especially when it's busy. So if you let the child have control of how much supermarket he's going to have to tolerate, like go in and he gives a signal, then you take him out, where he controls the sound. Now, the only problem with putting it on a recording device is MP3 files are not a full spectrum file. So it's better to use the real sounds, or if you have an old record player, the old-fashioned kind, those have the full spectrum. For electronic, you have to get really special things to get the full spectrum. So, okay, let's say you had an old smoke alarm. You wrap it up in towels, and you let him turn it on. And then you gradually take the towels off, where they control it. Sometimes it can be desensitized. Other things that might help, B6 and magnesium supplements, fish oil supplements. We have an omega-3 deficient diet in this country. And we're starting to get scientific reports back in that the omega-3s sometimes can be helpful. Sometimes auditory training works if you've got access to that.
Hi there. My son is 10, and he has, I'm right here,
I
right next to the lady that just spoke.
Okay, see,
Hi.
I can't, the sound, I can't tell where it's coming from.
Yeah,
Okay.
my son is 10, and he has high-functioning autism, ADHD, and sensory issues, and since he was little. But he is deathly afraid of animals that aren't contained, like dogs and cats and horses. And it's very debilitating, and we have ABA therapy. We're working on desensitization.
Well, first of all, you got to figure out what is it about the animals you're afraid of. Is he afraid the dog will bark? And if the dog barks, that hurts his ears. Because I get asked all the time, should I get a therapy dog for kids? I mean, some kids are like instant best buddies with the dogs. Others warm up to them. And there's others, they hate them because you never know when the cat's going to meow or the dog's going to bark. So first of all, you got to figure out what aspect of the dog makes him afraid. Was he ever bitten by a dog? You know, that would be something that would make him afraid. Or is it that the animal makes sudden movement that bothers him visually, or it's all of a sudden it might meow or bark and hurt his ears? What do you think the problem is?
To my knowledge, he's never been bitten. It's mostly the movement and the barking, like the noise.
Yeah, that's sensory.
Yeah.
That is sensory. Now, might be good to have worked with an OT or somebody that can work with some of the sensory problems. You know, sometimes some of these sensory problems, they kind of outgrow them. Now, with rapid movement, does he like flags? Because flags is a rapid movement that he can control. And that might help, going to play with flags where he can control them. Unfortunately, I can't always control a dog. Right. But flags, I loved them. See, the thing is, some kids love rapid movement. I was actually attracted to flags. Other kids, hate rapid movement.
I don't know, I'll have to try that and see. Yeah.
But you have to try to, the thing you got to be with these kids is sort of gently insistent. You see, if you push too hard, there's no advancement. If you don't push enough, if you push too hard, I'm getting mixed up here. If you push too hard, you get a meltdown. But if you don't push at all, you don't get any advancement. Just remember, no surprises. Surprises scare. But they'll oftentimes get this insistence of sameness. Well, you want to try some new things, but you don't make it a surprise. Okay, if we're going to go to a new restaurant, you might go to their website and get some pictures of the inside of that restaurant, so they know what they're getting into. That was done when I went out to the ranch. I was scared to go out to the ranch, but it wasn't a surprise. I knew about it 3 months in advance. Best thing I ever did is what got me into the cattle business. College experience. Mm-hmm. I had a lot of social problems in the dorm. It was not easy. But there are problems I'm saying kids in college have today that I did not have. Basic things like getting up on time, not losing homework, finding buildings. I think this gets back to kids not being taught enough basic skills, like shopping, doing laundry. These things were a non-issue for me. Tons of social problems. It wasn't easy. But I was reading the other day about a kid that couldn't figure out how to buy his books at the bookstore. Well, I was buying comic books at the newsstand when I was 7. And I knew that I couldn't stand there and read them. I had to buy them. And that I couldn't touch stuff that I wasn't going to buy. I mean, I learned these basic skills very early. We had fancy sit-down Sunday dinners at my aunt's and my grandmother's, and I had to behave. I was allowed to have my place to run off steam. At Aunt Bella's house, I could run up and down this big hall after dinner and watch myself get big in the mirror. And at Granny's, she lived in a 5th-floor apartment. I could play beat the elevator going in, running up the fire stairs, and I could do beat the elevator going down. So those are some places to run off some steam. But otherwise, I had to behave, and most of the time I did. And there's problems now that, they aren't learning how to do enough stuff on their own. And I'm seeing this with kids that are a lot less severe than I am. Driving, I get asked all the time about learning how to drive. I did a year on easy roads before I went anywhere near a freeway. Because what you got to do is you got to learn, because of the problems with multitasking, you got to get to where the operation of the car goes on autopilot. Steering, braking, using the gas. Well, I started out at my aunt's ranch on dirt roads. 3 miles out to the mailbox every day, 3 miles back. That really started getting the operation of the car learned. And she had a really balky 3-on-the-column, balky clutch pickup. This was not an easy car to learn how to drive.
Hi, Temple.
Okay.
I teach a film class at the local community college here, and I'm just wondering about the HBO film. How much time did you spend with Claire Danes when she was trying to portray you, and what did you think about her portrayal?
Well, she did a fantastic job, and seeing her in that movie was like going into the weird 60s and 70s time machine. And I spent half a day with her, but she videotaped it. And then I gave her all these ancient old 20-year-old VHS tapes that I had, oldest stuff I could find. I spent a lot of time with Nick Jackson, the director, Emily Gerson-Sains, the producer, and the writers. And then I spent quite a lot of time on cattle stuff, making sure they had the right kind of cattle We can't have any stupid city slicker things like Holstein cattle on a beef ranch. I mean, no way.
Hi. Over this way. My daughter is high-functioning autistic, and one of the reasons why I didn't get her diagnosed early is because she was extremely affectionate. And I was interested in your relationship with your mother, and I didn't know if you are affectionate with her at this point.
Well, I had touch sensitivity problems, so I didn't want to be hugged. Well, the squeeze machine broke like about 5 years ago, so I'm hugging real people now. The thing is, I think it's really important, like these kids that don't want to be hugged, to try to desensitize that. Just remember, tickle touches set off an alerting response. Deep pressure is calming. And that's actually one of the easier things to desensitize. Oftentimes much easier to desensitize than the hearing sensitivity problem. And you gradually, just try to hug me more, and, it got to where I stopped having that tendency to pull away. You see, again, it was oversensitivity in the nervous system. I wanted to feel the nice feeling of being held, but it was just too intense. Okay, right here. How did I cope with anxiety? Well, one of the things, when I got into high school, I started having horrible, horrible panic attacks. And that's the reason why I built the squeeze machine in the first place. Because it was just like, oh, imagine if you're locked up in this theater and there was a lion and a tiger walking around in here. Well, you'd be worried about getting eaten, and so you'd be constantly vigilant, like where could I go so the tiger wouldn't come eat me. And I watched cattle going through the squeeze chute for their vaccinations, and I noticed that some of the cattle kind of relaxed. So I went and tried out the squeeze chute on the ranch, and I found that it calmed me down. So then I built this squeeze chute-like device. That helped. Also, lots of exercise. Lots and lots of exercise. I do 100 sit-ups every night on the bed, every hotel room, every single night. And do I enjoy them? No, I hate them. Now, as I went through my 20s, my anxiety got worse and worse and worse and worse. And I went on antidepressant medication. Now, where antidepressant medication really works is for anxiety. It works much better for anxiety than it does for depression. Little tiny dabs of Prozac, that works well for a lot of people. I'm taking an old drug called desipramine. Now, the thing is, when you're using antidepressants for anxiety, much lower doses than the label. The big mistake that's made is, and I've talked to 100 parents on this, worked great on a low dose, they doubled the dose, then you had agitation and insomnia. Doctors are raising doses when they should be lowering doses. And oftentimes for anxiety, you only need 1/4 to 1/2 the starter dose. So, like for Prozac, for example, that half a starter dose would be 10 milligrams. For some of the other antidepressants, look it up in the book and divide by 2 or divide by 4, maybe that's the dose that will work. And I don't know why this seems to be a concept that people have a hard time getting their head around. Because I read all these studies that get done, and they're going, oh, well, this bunch of people dropped out of this study. Well, they had them overdosed on it. That's why they dropped out of the study. Now, I'm absolutely appalled at the amount of antipsychotic drugs being given out to 5-year-olds. Absolutely appalling. Things like Risperidol, Abilify, Seroquel, because the side effects are just horrendous. I'd rather do some of the special diets and omega-3s and some of those things on little kids. And maybe for anxiety, try something like Prozac. The problem you've got with drugs like Risperidol and Abilify is they have horrendous side effects, like tardive dyskinesia, Parkinsonian-like nerve damage, getting disgustingly obese, getting diabetes, getting problems with prolactin, hormone problems, all kinds of bad things. Now, sometimes there's a place where you might have to use these drugs. Like you have an older child or an adult, super aggressive, that's where you use a tiny, tiny dose of Risperidol, often really tiny. The other thing is, you got really bad sound sensitivity, and I don't want to do this in little kids, but in older kids where the sound sensitivity is really horrible, it's a microscopic dose of Risperidol. So microscopic that you're probably going to have to, it's going to be hard to cut it up, cut the pills up enough to get it small enough. And that can sometimes stop sound sensitivity. Now, it's hard for doctors to get their head around not following a label. Well, you see, that's a top-down thinking. But I know one lady that couldn't do convention center, and she's doing 1/4 of a milligram of Risperidol a day, 1/4 of a milligram. a day. That's like a weeny little microscopic dose, and she can do convention center. Now, if you're interested in the medication stuff, I strongly recommend you get Thinking in Pictures and the second edition of The Way I See It. It has to be the second edition of The Way I See It, and read the medical sections in there very carefully. Okay, right there.
Hi, I wanted to know if you have taught yourself to eat more than Jell-O, and if so, how did you do that?
Now, the thing about the Jell-O and the yogurt and all that stuff is that before I went on the antidepressants, I had horrendous colitis attacks. So I'd go on yogurt and Jell-O because it was the only way to get the colitis attacks under control. And when I went on the antidepressants in my early 30s, guess what? The colitis went away. And a lot of splitting headaches I had went away. I do eat a lot more things now. I still eat quite a lot of yogurt because it helps with some of my infection problems.
Hi,
okay, what?
Hi, Temple. Hi, Temple Grandin. My name is Joyce, and I have 3 sons with autism. They're 24, 20, and 13, and I might have autism myself. I think in pictures all the time. My dad was an aerospace engineer at McDonnell Douglas who never went to college, and he thought in pictures.
Well, that's the thing. I talked to a retired NASA space scientist that just had his grandson diagnosed with autism, and he said that half the people who worked at NASA probably on the spectrum. I mean, seriously, when you think about it, the social people don't want to, build rockets and, Apollo project and things like that. But, we need to be getting some of these smart young Aspies and get them solving the energy crisis. That's what we need to be doing. But I want to emphasize, not everybody on the high end of the spectrum is a techie. We really want to emphasize that. You have some of the art types, some of the real techie engineering types, and then you got others that are the word types. These are some that might be good at being journalists and things like this, and they definitely are not interested in technical subjects.
My question for you was, with my family, we're having a really hard time going through college or going through education system because we have trouble writing from the way that we're thinking, and I was wondering...
When you say problems with writing, problems with handwriting or problems with writing composition?
Writing compositions from what we're thinking because it doesn't really mesh with what we're thinking. And I was wondering how you managed to write all those books with thinking and pictures, and I don't seem, to me, my pictures are like a million words.
Well, I like
to put it on paper, I can't figure
writing
it out
books.
I brainstorm.
Like if you go on Grandin.com, that's my cattle website. Everything on that I wrote myself, and there's no co-authors there. What I have to do to not ramble is break things down with an outline where I do no more than 2 double-spaced pages for each subject on the outline. Otherwise, I ramble all over the place, and I've got to slow down, describe the picture in my mind. When I was a young child, we'd write compositions in English, and then the teacher would red mark up and copy edit the work. I never understood the rules of grammar, but the teacher would just copy edit it up, and then I'd have to go back and correct it. And I think one of the problems today is we're not doing enough writing assignments, and even in college they did this. Do a little 3-page writing assignment, the teacher would red mark it up, and then you had to go and correct it. And that's how you learn how to write. Just having people copy edit work.
Hi. Oops, sorry about that. My question is about food. My daughter has aversions to food that she didn't used to have aversions to, and it made me think of your example with the horse with the black cat. I'm thinking at some point there's something that happened. How, as a parent, can I determine what might have set her off, and how can I desensitize her?
A lot of food aversion things are sensory. And one of the things you can do is, get some of the, puts her favorite food on the plate and then put some of the little bit of something that she doesn't like and gradually try to get her to eat some of the stuff she doesn't like and, then reward her for it. Okay?
Hi, my brother has autism, borderline Asperger's, and I was wondering, how do I get him to actually talk? He likes to look at art and stuff, but he just doesn't talk. How can I? Okay,
so you say he's completely nonverbal?
For the most part, yes.
Well, there are some people that are nonverbal can learn how to type on the computer.
He can do that.
And he can type on the computer independently.
Yes.
Good.
And I was just wondering how can I get him to actually start speaking?
Well, Kenny's, has he ever spoken any words at all?
Oh, he has. He at one point he's been able to even say my name, but I mean he can speak every now and then. But I just want to try to actually see if I can get him to speak so he can have conversations.
Well, Kenny, maybe he'll be someone who's just going to have conversations running. Can you converse with him on the computer?
No, he doesn't understand that, unfortunately.
So he doesn't write on the computer either, because there are some people that are nonverbal that look extremely low functioning, like there's a lady named Carly. She's going to be coming out with a new book. There's Tito Mukapatahe. When you see him, he looks totally low functioning, but he can type independently on the computer. He has a book, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? And he'll come in flapping, and I ask him one question, and he can type it out really fast, and then he gets up and flaps. And I asked him what it was like before he had typing, and he said it was emptiness, and that his sensory world was just a jumble of colors and stimulation. He's definitely an auditory learner.
Hi, my question's about stimming. When I was very, very young, I used to do this thing called bonking, which is essentially where you just bang your head on the couch repeatedly so you could fall asleep or sit on the dryer, that kind of thing. Did you do anything like this? Any self-named behavior that would help you
I
function?
did rocking, and I did dribbling sand through my hands, and there was this brass plate that covered up a bolt held the bed together. And I'd spin this brass plate around and around, watch it spin, and I could just get kind of hypnotized by this. Now, one of the reasons why kids do stimming is to calm down. And I was actually allowed to have an hour after lunch where I could go stim. But then the rest of the time it wasn't allowed. It wasn't allowed at the dinner table or at church or at school. I think it's okay for a kid to have some downtime where they're allowed specifically to stim, but then there's other places like the dinner table where you want to not be doing it. Because if a kid's allowed to just stim all day, his brain's not going to develop. Because when I did stimming, I could just shut out the world. Sometimes it's done to shut out noise that hurts and things like this. Well, maybe should we keep going? Okay. Maybe we'll take like 3 more questions, and then I'll go out and do some books and talk to you out in the hall.
Hello.
And they got some wicked little desserts out there. I already ate some of them. Okay. Okay, we're going to take 3 more quick ones, and then we're going to end up.
Over here.
Okay.
I'm just curious, is it possible to train the brain to go from, for example, a verbal mind to an auditory mind, or are you are what you are?
Well, there's a lot of brain plasticity, and you can train the brain to do a lot of things, but I don't think you're going to take a photorealistic visual thinker like me and turn me into an algebra expert. I don't think that's going to happen. You get into the whole argument about what's innate and genetic and what's learned. They're both really important because the research is very clear that the early intervention, the worst thing you could do with an autistic 3-year-old is just let them sit and rock all day. That's the worst thing you could do with them. You've got to kind of pull them out of it so their brains can develop.
Okay. If you could see a real-time image of your brain, and if people could see a live real-time image of their brain, would this help brain development?
Well, there's the scanning technologies evolving. And the thing that's interesting is this scanning method they used on me, it's not the scanner machine itself, it's all in the software. Well, and who would have made that software? Somebody on the spectrum. They said, I want you to put 50 supercomputers in a box the size of this lectern, and they did it. This is where you're working on the job. You give them jobs where there's a certain outcome. It's got to do a certain kind of scanning and fit in this box. Okay, that's an outcome. Us visual thinkers, we're going to be good at things like design, graphic arts, industrial design, photography. The mathematicians, they're your engineers and your computer scientists. And then you got the word thinkers. They need to be thinking about the different kinds of jobs. Okay, over here. Empathy. I have a lot of empathy for things like physical hardship. Somebody loses their house. I can really relate to that. The physical hardship kind of things. I just imagine I wouldn't want anything like that happening to me. How would I like it if I got thrown out of my house and all my stuff was out in the street? I certainly wouldn't like that. I have a lot of empathy for those kinds of things. Somebody is really poor, they can't get basic health care, and they're really sick. That's a horrible place to be.
So I teach martial arts to students, and I have a lot of parents come in who have kids with disabilities like autism and Asperger's and ADHD. Would you think that that was a good place for them? And if not, could you recommend a good sport or activity
Well, I've heard
like
a
that?
lot of good things about martial arts because it teaches discipline. You've got to cooperate with other people that are there. I think these kind of activities can be extremely good. We need to be getting these kids into activities where there's shared interests. For me, it was horseback riding and the electronics lab and model rocket club. And those places were also refuges away from teasing, and they were a place where I was appreciated for my skills. That's the other important thing. I had to learn how to sell my work. And people thought, I remember going to an ag engineering meeting back in the early 70s, and they thought I was so weird and they wouldn't talk to me, and I whipped out one of those drawings. And they go, oh, you did that? Well, maybe you're worth talking to. Well, I think with that, we'll end with that, and thank you all for coming.